Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm determined that the debate tonight is deep, complex, nuanced. So I'm just going to start off. If you prefer nature to capitalism, on the count of three, shout nature. 1, 2, 3. Nature. If you prefer capitalism to nature, on the count of three, shout capitalism. 1, 2, 3. And if you think it's a false dichotomy, on the count of three, shout false dichotomy. 1, 2, 3. Very good. I think we've resolved that then. Now, capitalists don't care about the environment, industry, agriculture, and commerce have long exploited nature's resources. The pursuit of profit pays scant regard to the underlying costs of using up the planet's capital. That is the familiar story. But, as we'll hear this evening, a growing number of voices are claiming that big business and nature, in fact, can make perfect partners. Harnessing and protecting nature, they argue, it's simply good business sense. Forests, for example, perform carbon capture worth £2.3 trillion a year. Nature not only does this for free, but it executes it with greater efficiency than any supply chain manager could dream of. This is just one example of how business can thrive through collaboration with nature. But the question is, can solutions that put nature and capitalism together be developed on a mass scale? Or is this vision of business and nature working hand in hand across the globe just a case of wishful green thinking? So tonight, Intelligence Squared, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, has brought together some of the world's leading conservation experts, along with voices from the worlds of finance and industry, to ask whether working in tandem with nature is the soundest investment that business can make. Let me tell you how things are going to work. We're going to hear from our speakers. Each could speak for hours on end, and they would fascinate you, but they've been given a mere 3 or 4 minutes to tell you who they are, and what their take is on this question, the relationship between nature and capitalism. When we've heard their initial take, then I'm going to get a little bit of a conversation going between them. Then we're going to open it up, the most important part of the evening. We're going to open it up to you to ask your questions, to make your points. I'll bring the panel in during that conversation, and then we'll bring them in right at the end before we finish off at 8 o'clock. So it's going to be a really fascinating conversation. Let me tell you about the speakers in turn. So our first speaker is Peter Kareiva, who's Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy and co-founder of the Natural Capital Project, a pioneering partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Stanford University, and WWF. And I think each speaker deserves a bit of encouragement from you. So please welcome Peter Kareiva. Yeah. No, that was a symbolic pause. Peter did fly in yesterday, so you are with us, aren't you, Peter?
I flew in from Seattle, the great Northwest, and I'm a scientist, a biologist, a research biologist. I grew up loving nature. And for the last 6 years of my life, I've been dedicated to this Natural Capital Project. And what we do is we write models of ecosystems that try to predict what are the consequences of choices businesses make, of choices governments make, of choices cities make, of choices school districts make, of choices consumers make, and what those choices mean for the balance of nature that we have left. And we don't just write the models, we write software, and it's meant to be open access. Anybody could use that software and start being a little bit smarter about how they use nature. We've done it in about 24 projects all around the world: China, Mongolia, Chile, Colombia, the US, all over the world. And we've learned a lot from it. And in the phrase of the great British poets, I don't care much for money, because money can't buy you love. Money can buy you nature. And so the take-home lesson that I've learned, and that my colleagues have learned, that this position that we started with, that quote that you started with, that adversarial quote, if business is an adversary of nature, nature doesn't stand a chance. And in the long run, business doesn't stand a chance. And so it's all about getting nature and business allied. I think our debate and discussion tonight will be very much about how we do that, what are the mechanisms for doing that, and if we can get that right, both business and nature will thrive. And I think I'll turn it over to my colleagues for their opening.
Thank you. Can I just ask you one question, Peter? As you've done your work, as you've explored this, have you become more or less optimistic about the possibility of business and nature working hand in hand?
I've become much more optimistic, but I've also realized it's much more complicated and difficult than sort of the platitudes that we throw around. So it's really, really hard. We have deep engagements with businesses, and it's not as simple as just saying the markets are going to solve our problems.
And what's the hardest problem of all?
The hardest problem of all is the short-termism of business. And I would say that the hardest problem is that in a world where stock turns over very fast, people are looking for really, really rapid profits, it's very difficult on those timescales for nature to return its profits and build its assets on a timescale that matters.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Okay, our second speaker is Tony Juniper, Sustainability Advisor, former Executive Director of Friends of the Earth, author of What Nature Does for Britain, which I think is available outside. You'll sign it, won't you?
They're already signed.
Oh, very
Save
good.
time.
And co-author. And co-author with the Prince of Wales of Harmony, a new way of looking at our world. Please welcome Tony Juniper.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Matthew. I'm a conservationist, an environmentalist, a naturalist. I've pursued those interests for more than 30 years in a variety of different roles, working as a scientist, as a communicator, trying to influence policy, and also, as Matthew said, as the director of Friends of the Earth in this country for some years. For the last 6 or so years, I've been working more independently as a writer. This book is published on Thursday, What Nature Does for Britain, as an advisor to private sector companies, working with the University of Cambridge and a program there on sustainability leadership, and also helping the Prince of Wales with some of his sustainability initiatives. So I remain very much engaged in this, but more as an individual rather than as an organization these days. I have to say, in the 3 decades that I've been involved with this particular cause, I think we have to mark some really quite important progress in legislation, in international agreements, in the level of engagement between the private sector and some of these questions, levels of public awareness. Our scientific knowledge is far advanced. So with all of that progress under our belt, why is it still the case that there is a rising concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, an ongoing rapid loss of biological diversity, the depletion of natural resources, intractable pollution problems in different parts of the world? The reason all of those things continue despite the progress, I would argue, is because we see environmental problems as environmental, when in fact environmental problems are economic failures. And this is why I think this evening's discussion is so important, because the reason we still continue to act upon the science is because we've fallen victim to a mythology that tells us that looking after nature is the enemy of growth, competitiveness, and job creation. This is the argument we now have to win if we are to protect life on Earth and indeed human civilizations that depend upon it. And that's why I spend much of my time these days writing books like What Nature Does for Britain, and before it, What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, unearthing this vast body of evidence that's being collected by TNC and others, showing how the human economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of ecology, not the other way around. Our economic system depends fundamentally on pillars of nature for it to exist. If we can understand that and embed that basic insight into how governments make choices and how businesses are run, then we will have a very bright future here on Earth, living as part of nature rather than the enemy of it.
Thank you, Tony. Can I ask, Tony, if you talk to large corporations, they nearly always now have a pretty strong story about their sustainability record. And indeed, there are many chief executives of large corporations who seem to be personally passionate about this issue, but yet it doesn't seem to make difference at scale. What is the fundamental problem about, well, why is it that the good intentions of all these corporations don't seem to make a difference at the kind of global level?
2 problems, I would say, in addition to the short-termism that's already been mentioned. Problem number 1 is that it is still a small group of pioneers, Unilever, B&Q, Marks and Spencer's. In their sectors, they stand out, But for the main part, in most business sectors, it is still not the majority that are moving on this. And in an open market situation, if you take more action than your competitors, there will come a point when you start to lose business share, lose money, and you go out of business. So there is a laggardly break, if you will, on progress. The other thing is the policy environment and the extent to which politicians are not elevating the playing field. And if the leadership that's being demonstrated by some companies can be backed by policy choices that support that from government, I think we will see an acceleration towards scale very quickly.
Great, thank you very much. Our third speaker is Jeremy Oppenheim, who's leader of McKinsey's global practice on sustainability and resource productivity. In 2014, he took a year's sabbatical to head up the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, whose report, Better Growth, Better Climate, has been described as stern too. Please welcome Jeremy Oppenheim.
So thank you all very much, and I'm of course at risk of agreeing too much with the people who have already spoken. I'm a development economist by background. I spent 10 years working in some of the poorest countries in the world, and that very much frames my view of the whole debate about economic development, growth, conservation. It has to start with people, right? For me, it starts with people and addressing the root causes of poverty, and that then needs to interact with how we approach questions of our ecology and of nature. So that's my starting point and my starting frame. I do come from the camp which is that it is an utterly false dichotomy to describe capitalism as being in competition with nature or with conservation. I think it's unhelpful. What we know, here's some of the things that we know. Right? We know that actually economic growth is a good thing for nature over time. There will be periods in the development of any country where that economic growth will hurt nature and will lead to the degradation of nature, but actually as countries become wealthier, the quality of nature and our ability to protect nature and to fund it goes dramatically up. So if we want to protect nature, we will need economic growth, and that may involve, for some countries, a period during which their natural capital deteriorates. We need to put prices in place. If you want to protect nature, in some way we're going to have to price it, and if we don't price it, do not be surprised at the consequences. So the question of how we price it is a really important and subtle debate, and we will get to that, I'm sure, this evening. But unpriced, we leave it unprotected. We need brands. Companies that have brands have reputations to protect, and they have reputations to protect globally. So the more that we have a capitalist system that creates highly valuable brands that are susceptible to the pressure of civil society, the more we will protect nature. And we need technology, because the only way in a planet that is likely to have 9 billion or more people that will be looking for the lifestyles that everybody here enjoys, and remember that this is a very privileged kind of Western setting that we're holding this conversation in, but if you want to have a world in which the other 7 to 8 billion people can aspire to have these kinds of conversations with this quality of life, then we need technology, and that will only scale, as far as we can tell, through capitalism. Now, if we just have a kind of naive interpretation of capitalism, that it's unregulated, that there's nothing to do with policy, that there's no role of civil society, then of course you can set up the dichotomy. And if you think about pricing of nature that ignores distribution, right, and ignores the ecosystem services that nature provides to the very poor, or that ignores the spiritual aspects of nature, why we value nature more than for purely utilitarian purposes, then we will get prices wrong. But if we are able to take them into account, then we give ourselves a chance. So yes to capitalism, because without it, we will never have a chance of protecting nature in the kind of world that we are setting ourselves up for. But capitalism will only do its job in this respect, as in any other aspect of life, if we get policies right and if civil society plays its role in acting, as a source of conscience, not just for business, but also for the policymakers.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can I ask a question about, you talked about wise regulation, and as you say, when we see reform, it's often some combination of regulation, innovation. But why is it that it seems to be that the voice of business, the collective voice of business, through business organizations and lobbying organizations, always seems to be averse to regulation? And can you see that changing?
So I don't think it is always averse to regulation. I think it is sometimes averse to regulation. So I think we should be very careful before we homogenize business into one, undifferentiated community which is resolutely averse to any kind of regulation. Many leading companies want to see more regulation because, in fact, it makes the market work better for them rather than worse for them. Right? A regulated market will typically, in truth, be good for incumbents. So you will find a whole host of views across the business world, but what you will find, and I will be absolutely clear about this, is that most lobbying organizations from the business world are lowest common denominator organizations, and they absolutely play a race to the bottom game. And that's unfortunately their business model, and they are, on the whole, not a force for good. But there are many progressive companies, and I'm seeing more and more of them, walk away from some of the worst of the lobbying organizations. And we've seen Unilever leave Business Europe, and we're seeing other companies, really respected companies, either leaving or at the edge of leaving the worst of the lobbying organizations. And one of the things we should absolutely celebrate and encourage our progressive leading companies to do is to get out of those degrading organizations and show a proper voice of what progressive business can do.
Great, thank you very much. It's very interesting as the conversation rolls on to see where we think the particular pressure points are. It's very interesting. I didn't think that would come up at this stage, Jeremy, but you're identifying one, which is the way in which lobbying organizations compete, as it were, to be as you put it, lowest common denominator as possible. Fascinating. Our fourth speaker is Lucy Siegle, ethical living columnist for The Observer and author of To Die For, Is Fashion Wearing Out the World? Is that the one outside?
Yes.
Great. And Green Living in the Urban Jungle. Please welcome Lucy Siegle.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm not sure Green Living in the Urban Jungle is still in print, and if it is, it probably shouldn't be, so don't worry about that one.
Was it printed on recycled paper?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's been pulped, I think, which is good. Well, actually, that leads me into what I was going to say. My own, you can't really use the word journey anymore, can you, without sounding like an idiot? Okay, so my own experience of green issues has travelled quite a distance. So I started out with Green Living in the Urban Jungle, which was very, very enthusiastic, and thought that consumers, because I mainly write, we're all consumers, right, and we'd rather be on that side of the fence. That's the preferable side to be on. Consumers could change the world, maybe by making little lifestyle changes. How wrong I was, obviously. But I have been on I've had a fascinating experience. But ladies and gentlemen, I do feel a bit used, frankly. I have bought into the idea previously that corporations, the corporate world, the global economy, if you like, was going to spearhead this global sustainable revolution that we so badly needed. And I've been let down. And now I realise that I've been let down because nature and business are just not compatible bedfellows in any way. I think that business flirts with nature, but it never really takes it any further. And I will stop using these horrible sort of dating metaphors in a minute. I don't know why I'm expressing myself in this way. But I just think there has been, underneath it all, I think that what is good for business isn't necessarily good for nature. And if there's a note of bitterness, it's through my own experience and my own observations, particularly working with the fashion industry and looking at a textile supply chain. And that's important to me because it's a full spectrum industry. So it goes from the raw fibre right the way through into stores, into Fashion Week, into the kind of glamorous stuff that we all see. So I feel like I have seen a really good spread of a sector that encompasses quite a lot of things. We've heard some of the shortcomings of business, if you like, and those are some hints as to why I don't think it's a useful ally for nature. But nature also has its own weird idiosyncratic behaviour. It's chaotic, you know. In the rainforest, a tree may fall, it may take out other species as it goes down, and then other trees will grow and fill that light. And that's something that's unpredictable and chaotic. And that's not something that business can work with. That's not something that corporations, as they're set up, can really, really work with, unless they're incredibly nature-centric, which I don't think many of them are. I think that natural habitats at this point have already been defined to some extent by economic interests, and this is the real baseline that we're working from. I think a more genuine proposition is we've shaped nature, it looks like this, so how much now will corporations agree to save? And that's probably a less poetic way of looking at it. But I think we're in a power play, essentially. Nature that defies the logic of business, and business that operates for the short term and has different drivers, which can never be nature-centric. And ultimately, I think it's a bit of a failure of all of us when it comes to conservation. I don't think that we've managed to prove that nature is worthy of public subsidy and public investment, and now we've had to go to corporations. I think that's a pretty sad position to be in.
Lucy, I saw some research a few months ago which was very hopeful on page 1 and very depressing on page 2. Page 1 was how many people said that environmental issues matter to them as consumers. Page 2 was where that featured in the list of other priorities they had, for example, quality and cost and things like that. Is the problem that consumer power doesn't really matter, or is it that we as consumers haven't really prioritised environmental issues in our choices?
Well, consumers are, their behaviour is very, very difficult to predict. So we know this. So you'll say one thing and you'll actually do another. So that happens for a variety of reasons. And that's why those kind of surveys are always kind of problematic. But I don't think we can expect the consumer to prioritise the environment above all, with all the other noise that they've got on. It's that thing, isn't it? When you go to the supermarket or whatever, and you've got 2 screaming kids with you, and you know you've got like 10 minutes to get your stuff and get out. That point of purchase is a very bad place to try and have a conversation about the environment. Really, really bad place.
Some people obviously recognise exactly what you're
You know, feel my
talking
pain.
about. Thank you. Okay, last but not least, Nick Dearden, who's director of the World Development Movement, which campaigns in the UK on global justice issues. He's formerly the director of the Jubilee Debt Campaign and he was corporate campaign manager at Amnesty International UK. He's a regular contributor to The Guardian. Please welcome Nick Dearden.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. We've got a new name, actually. We're called Global Justice Now, but only for a week. So we were called the World Development Movement for 40 years. But we changed our name last week, and that's to reflect the fact that primarily we're a social justice organisation, but working on global issues. And so I wouldn't come here and say and describe myself really as a conservationist, but as somebody who's very interested in social justice. And I think the thing that we found in the last 10, 20, or probably even more years for people who are very far-sighted is you can't have social justice without taking the environment into account and without environmental justice as well. We work on a number of aspects of the global economy. We're currently working to try and stop a very big trade deal called TTIP between the US and the EU. We've worked to try to stop people speculating on food derivatives, which pushes the price of food up. And we're also working on a whole climate campaign around who controls our energy resources. And I would say, fundamentally, that's what most concerns me, is of course, the depletion of the world's resources, but how that fits into who controls those resources. Because we don't just, I agree with an awful lot of what Lucy just said, and we don't live in a world where we, as individual little atoms, can, through our individual market choices, actually decide what happens. And we don't control those resources. And over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen an increasing monopolization of the world's resources in the hands of a tiny, tiny proportion of the world's population. And that era of deregulation has been an unprecedented disaster for the world's environment and for climate change. And I don't think it's a surprise. I don't think it's because there's evil people at the top of our society, but I think if you say the only thing that matters, the only principle that matters in this world is maximizing your profits, and by the way, we will allow you to pass on as many costs as you can to the rest of us, to the rest of society, I don't think it's a big surprise that you're going to end up with a world that looks like the world that we live in today. I think putting a price on nature is exactly the wrong way to go. It is simply further commodifying, further marketizing those things that we should actually be uncommodifying, and unmarketizing. I think 6 years after the financial crisis, I would say not only should the environment not be run as a bank, but a bank shouldn't be run as a bank. And I think an awful lot of people, if you read the newspapers today, would probably agree with that analysis. I would like to stop seeing everything in the world as a commodity to make money off. And I don't think that is a pipe dream. And the reason I don't think it's a pipe dream is because we've done it. As a society after the Second World War, we decided the best way to give people decent health care was not to put a price on it, but to take a price off it, to run it as a social good with different principles from the principles applied by the market. And that's what I would argue is the solution to the environmental crisis that we face today, and many other social crises as well. That's the only way to radically reduce the inequality and the turbocharged market mechanism which has really driven the planet to the brink of catastrophe.
Thank you, Nick. Nick, concerned with social justice, I mean, one of the things which I'm sure you wouldn't deny is that the global record in bringing people out of absolute poverty over the last 20 years has been pretty impressive. I mean, unprecedented in human history, the number of people who've been taken out of absolute poverty. Do you think that that progress in terms of rising living standards at the very poorest level can happen without the engine of global capitalism?
Certainly, I think it can happen without capitalism. Whether it can happen without growth is a different matter, but I certainly think it can happen without capitalism, because the vast majority of the people who've been lifted out of poverty in the last 20 years were lifted out of poverty in China. Now, I'm not saying China is a non-capitalist country, but it certainly hasn't applied the principles of the free market to the way that it's developed. I'm not saying it's a perfect model. There's many problems I've got with the way China's developed. Nonetheless, it has raised more people out of poverty than anywhere else in the world, which should cause us to really question the model that we're constantly expounding as the answer to the answer to poverty. If you look at where most of the benefits of growth go at the moment with our Western model of capitalism, they go to the very, very top. Since the financial crash in the United States, 95% of all the extra growth that's been created have gone to the top 1%. Virtually everything. That's not a solution for getting people out of poverty or for creating a more sustainable environment.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope you're all starting to think about the questions and the points that you're going to make. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions of the panel. Don't feel you've all got to respond to these, but just before we bring the audience in, one thing we haven't talked about quite as much as I thought we would is finance, which in a sense is the bit of capitalism which has taken the rap for what's happened over the last few years. But it's also particularly finance that people are focusing on as providing possibly an answer as to how it is we can defend nature. Peter, can you start by talking about how it is you think, if you do think, that finance capitalism can be mobilized to protect the environment?
So certainly there's large movements of investors that care about the environment. You know, some of the biggest pension funds in the United States have a commitment to both social benefits and environmental benefits. And for a number of investors who are willing to sacrifice maybe the highest rate of return, so not the instant turnaround, because of their values. There is a value judgment here. There is personal values involved. Seek out to make investments that return both their dollars and return benefits to nature. So that's personal choice of people with values who care about nature, which are pretty widespread. Just listen to the applause early on about people that care about nature in this hall right here. Personal values of investors, pension funds that care about nature are making choices to put their money where it returns two things. It returns improved ecosystems. It can return improved livelihoods for rural communities in Africa, and it can return dollars.
Jeremy?
If you want capitalism in its financial form to invest at scale in protecting nature, there's got to be some way in which it can get a return, right? Or it will remain in the kind of narrow bucket of what they call impact investing, which is worth a few billion a year. It's worth 20, 30 billion a year, and that's not bad. But the world, just so we're clear, invests over 20 trillion a year. So it invests 1,000 times more than any current estimate of impact capitalism. So I care about the 20 trillion, right, because that's the big lever, not the small one. And I want to make sure that as much of that is invested in a way that's either consistent or supportive of nature as possible. And whether we like it or not, that means that it's got to be investing in those opportunities that have good returns, that are driven either by prices or by regulation. Right? And you can dance your way around this if you like. Right? I'm very happy for anyone to show me how to do that. And we can come up with banks that are not banks, and we can figure out how to, spend £120 billion on the NHS every year without a functioning market economy. I'd love to understand how we will do that. But until someone can show me how we will do that, I'll go with pricing and regulation that creates business opportunities that can move money at the scale that's needed. And we are going to invest over the next 15 years $90 trillion in the infrastructure of the world. That is $6 trillion a year, $6 trillion every single year. And I want to see as much of that invested in the forms of infrastructure that are low carbon, that are compatible with protecting nature as possible. And to do that, we need the policies and the prices to be right.
I would totally agree with that. That the policies can change it, but right now we don't have the policies.
Nick, coming back to you on this, we own these businesses ourselves indirectly, very often through pension funds and through other means. Are you not interested in the possibility that we can mobilize our collective power as the ultimate holders of these investments in order to drive different behaviors?
No, because it hasn't worked. It
And
hasn't
it
worked.
can never work?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've tried to use pension funds in campaigning before, and frankly, you come up against a brick wall because people don't think of it as their own wealth in the same way, and they don't treat it as they would actually like the world to be run. And frankly, the amount of accountability that pension funds have to us as ordinary individuals, atomized individuals, that's how we relate to our pension funds, is very, very weak. So, I mean, I've tried it, and I've seen many other people try it, and I simply don't think it works. The thing that interests me, I agree with the 20 trillion, that's what we need to get. The thing that interests me is why so much of that money is invested in a deregulated free market, and it's because of the policies that we've pursued over the last 30 years. It's because of massive tax avoidance. It's because of the liberation of capital on a global scale, so that profit repatriation can... I mean, it's the crisis of developing country after developing country, and we need to definancialize the economy. We need to put those resources back in public hands, and that has been done in the past. It was done in the 60s and 70s under industrial policy schemes when countries could control their own interest rates and so on. There's many ways that you can do this. But the first thing we've got to say is you can't just say, the world is like this now, let's see how best we deal with it, because there is no solution then. You have to change the world fundamentally. You have to change the economic system fundamentally if you want to take control of the resources that will allow us to solve the environmental crisis.
Can I just ask a question of the room? How many of you in this room, if you had an easy way to redirect your investments, such as they are in life insurance or pensions or savings or whatever, in a more environmentally responsible way, how many of you would take that choice if you had it? Put your hands up. And how many of you have done that already? Yeah, so quite a few, but it's still not making a difference at scale. Tony?
So on this point, Nick, about the campaigning that we've tried over the years on pension funds and others to create change, having not worked, you could say that nothing will work to influence that sector, or you might say, actually, did we have the wrong strategy when we were approaching these organizations? And I certainly think it might be the latter that we've got wrong. And certainly many of the campaigns that I ran in Friends of the Earth days to try and influence financial institutions, we were really making an ethical case, when in fact what we might more logically do today is make a case about managing risk. And certainly one of the campaigns that I've been really impressed by in recent times on this subject is an initiative called Carbon Tracker. You may have come across it. This is slightly more on the climate side than the conservation side, but it's very much related. What Carbon Tracker has done is gone to financial institutions and said to them, climate change is a major risk to your organization, not because people are going to think of you badly because you've not dealt with it and you're unethical people, but because there could be a real problem emerging from a carbon bubble that if we decide to implement policies to remain below 2 degrees of average global warming, most of the world's carbon fuel sources, coal, oil and gas, will have to remain in the ground. Therefore, what you should do as an investor is move your finance out of fossil fuels and into renewables. Now, the power of this argument, I note, is seen in part in the fact that the Bank of England has commissioned an inquiry to assess the risk to Britain's financial sector arising from that carbon bubble, because the science tells us that we need to remain below 2 degrees. If you divide up the carbon budget, then the numbers simply do not work. We have Shell and Total and other organizations saying, oh, well, it won't be affecting us because we're going to carry on burning this. But actually, I'm told that in meetings now with investors, the investors are pushing back and saying, can you prove that? And of course, they can't, thereby revealing a massive systemic risk to the entire financial system. Now, I think if people in the campaigning organizations were able to make those arguments more powerfully, I think we'd get further than the period, and I was very much a part of this, where we were trying to make the ethical case. I think for finance, risk speaks louder than values, even though many people in the sector do have values that they'd like to reflect. But I think once we can start to show that the system is at risk as a result of the degradation of nature, I think we get further quicker and we start to get the scale of shift that we need.
Yeah, but Lucy, I'll bring you back a second here, but Lucy, when you spoke to people in the fashion industry, for example, is one of the things that they said, well, we'd like to behave in a different way, we'd like to behave in a more environmentally sustainable way, but the problem is the investors, the people behind us, the financiers. Is that a common theme?
It's becoming a more common theme because fast fashion in particular, which is the bit that fills most of our wardrobes, so the high street brands called fast fashion, that phenomenon, that is becoming a real kind of investment opportunity for people. I actually have spoken to some investors about fast fashion, and they've kind of said to me, well, actually, what we value about it and what we really like is that it's really fast and it doesn't do much other than make money for us. So they like its lack of complexity on that level, which for me is obviously an issue. I really like what Tony's saying. You see, I'm so easily persuaded, but I do worry that
Do we believe that?
that the lever is still not a strong enough lever, and of course it shuts out millions of people who don't have pensions and don't have any savings. Hello, I'm one of those. That's an admission, and that for me is just still the wrong approach. Can I just mention brands?
Of course you
quickly? We talked about brands, or somebody mentioned brands at the start of this discussion. And one of the things for me has been that people, especially younger people perhaps, who don't have pensions, don't have savings necessarily, they feel that the brands are more responsive to them, are for them. And that they will have more leverage, maybe writing to the brands, trying to get them to change, trying to get them to embrace sustainability. This is particularly true of fashion brands, for example. Now, that is a problem as well, because that's not an effective lever. Because in my experience, you have a few brands who will message on sustainability or do something good for nature and put themselves out there as the sustainable brands. And that is a marketing a point of view, because it shows a point of differentiation between them and the other brands. If they were all to do it, it's not attractive for them, because they're competitive, and it becomes a competitive issue. So I think what we're really lacking are levers to enforce this change. It doesn't work, and it brings me back to business versus nature are not good allies.
Okay, great. One last question, panel. If you can be really brief, because then I want to bring the audience back in. But I'm going to end with an even more kind of pessimistic perspective, which is this. I mean, we think of Europe as being a kind of reasonably functioning part of the world, but we can't sort out Ukraine, we can't sort out what's going on in Greece. Isn't one of the massive barriers to action here the weakness of global governance institutions? Because action is required, obviously in terms of climate change, but also in terms of conservancy, where sometimes you're trying to raise money in one country to persuade another country, which is developing, to protect a bit of its own ecosystem. Jeremy, You're broadly confident, but how does your confidence stand up to the weakness of global action?
Well, the work we did, and this report, which you referred to earlier, called Better Growth, Better Climate, produced by the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, took the line that we couldn't rely on global governance, right? That relying on the international institutions as the driver of change in terms of economic policy that would need to then feed into both better economic outcomes and better climate, but more broadly environmental outcomes. We could not rely on those international institutions. And so what we did was we looked very carefully at national policy. What would be in countries' economic and social self-interest, irrespective of what other countries chose to do? And what we find, and the work of the Commission, was that in low-income and middle and high-income countries, irrespective of choices that other countries might make, it turns out to be in the interests of those countries to take coherent action to improve economic policy, to actually build better cities, which have less pollution and less congestion and generate less carbon emissions. To, in Peter's world, apply better approaches to land use, because it's getting land use right that drives productivity, that protects water resources, that protects forests, that protects soil. This doesn't need a global agreement. This requires local action and local understanding. And the same is true for energy systems. So for us, the key to this is to get the understandings and actions at the local level and to get the politics and policy right there. Because if we don't do that, the chance of getting it at the global level is zero.
Tony, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do broadly, and I just add that most of the outcomes that occur pretty much anywhere at nation, state level, or even a city, they are down to economic choices. And if we can't build ecological capacities into how we do economics, we're always going to be failing, because there's always this balancing act going on. On the one hand, we want economic growth. On the other, we want to conserve nature. Whichever country you look at, pretty much at the moment, economic growth is always the heavier part of the equation and skews decisions to the point where we see all these trends continuing. The reason for this is because nature is completely invisible on the calculations that are being made by the economists. And if you start to look at some of the calculations being done for countries, including this one, for example, we had the Office for National Statistics recently publish some material suggesting that elements of natural capital in this country are worth about £1.5 trillion, which is equivalent to the fiscal deficit. You never hear the depletion of our natural capital being talked about because it's not being debated as part of economic policy. It's nature, it's ecology, it's somewhere else. It's not to do with mainstream issues. And so until we can close that gap, I fear that we won't be seeing reality as it truly is, whereby we're losing wealth, we're degrading systems that we fundamentally rely upon because they're nowhere to be seen at the real decision-making table, which is in treasuries, in finance ministries, and in those departments that are trying to drive economic growth. And in fact, this is where actually I think something is being overlooked by the more radical end of the campaigning spectrum here, because this discussion that's now opening up the idea of natural capital, I think offers an opportunity for campaigners to do what they've been trying to do for some years, which is to have a more realistic approach towards economic valuation. Because at the moment, all we measure is GDP. We're not measuring human happiness. We're not measuring the state of nature. If we do start to get some real metrics that have got real weight and real technical expertise behind them, I think we could start to have a much more interesting discussion around the kind of economy we want. It's a bit of a Trojan horse in many respects.
Lucy, it's kind of going back to the fashion industry that you've looked at. Our clothes come from all around the world. Young people travel all around the world. But yet our imaginations still seem to be incredibly parochial in terms of our kind of span of responsibility for the well-being of other people. Do you see any kind of change at all in that?
No, and that's one of the things, isn't it, that makes it very difficult, increasingly it seems, for people to engage with habitats on the other side of the world and to engage with wilderness areas or whatever you want to call them, that they have no experience of them. And there's quite a lot of evidence that shows that people are becoming more divorced from nature. And I think it's very easy for us to be hoodwinked and satiated by other things. So I do worry really strongly that we have a generation growing up that's got access to cheap tech, cheap food and cheap clothes, and being robbed of things that should sustain it and are for the long term. I think that's absolutely one of the fundamental points over all of this, is that is what seems to me is happening. I just wanted to say something about the happiness index, GDP. I've tried that story so many times, Tony. I don't think anyone's ever. It gets a few news stories about Bhutan being the happiest, country in the world, and then I don't think it's got legs.
Okay, we'll come back to happiness. Well,
realistically,
we'll come back to happiness later on, as I often say to my wife. Okay.
Old jokes are the best, aren't they?
Nick and Peter, can I end with, before we open up, just something for you. Peter, I think Nature Conservancy works to a certain extent with foundations and philanthropists, and it seems to me that they are a group that do see things on an international scale. They are amongst the only organisations and people who have a kind of truly global lens. Is that what is your work encouraging in the sense of a kind of group of people who are starting to see things on a global scale?
Well, I think a lot of people see things at a global scale now. It's not just climate change. Think about water and soil. We're losing soil at 10 times the rate we're replenishing it. That's increasingly known by the food production world, and food is a global commodity. And so there is concern about being able to maintain food security unless we do the natural capital. It's the risk to our food supply by mismanaging our ecosystem. That's the whole point of the Natural Capital Project, is to put those numbers on it that Tony is talking about, and water is another thing. I think sometimes climate is a wicked problem, and it's hard for us to see the feedbacks on climate in our lifetime. It's a lot easier to see the feedbacks on soil and water in 5 years. And in some cases, those will be the levers and the dimensions of natural capital that will create the most rapid valuation and sort of valuation of nature.
And then, Nick, finally, you, before we open it up. I do worry about the capacity of nation states to be able to be benign actors on the global scale because of the nature of the argument about kind of national self-interest. But some people argue it's actually global corporations and global NGOs who are the most capable of having a kind of grown-up conversation about this. If you were invited tomorrow amidst 20 other global NGOs to sit down with the 20 largest business leaders in the world, do you think you'd have anything that you could talk usefully to them about?
No, because it's
no. Nothing.
Because
So you wouldn't even go.
Because it's not about rational conversation. The only way we're going to change anything is by building public awareness and by building movements around what we're talking about. And this is what worries me so much about the idea that we talk to everyone as if they're an investor or a consumer. First of all, not everyone is an investor or a consumer, quite right, so you immediately remove 3/4 of the world population from having any say over any of this stuff. But even for those who are investors and consumers, the problem is you are buying into a framing that's been absolutely disastrous for the environment in general. What we need to be talking about is we are citizens in democratic societies who should have more ownership over our government and through our government through international institutions. I mean, we talk about weak international institutions. We've got some very strong international institutions like the IMF, and we've got some very strong world trade rules. If we want to do it, we can do it. We can have very strong rules indeed, but we don't on the environment because there's not an interest from the people that run the world in doing it. So we have to push that. And I think the idea that we've become, the way that this deregulation agenda was sold to ordinary people, the way this privatization agenda was sold to ordinary people is, you're a consumer, right? Your identity is judged by how well your life is doing as an investment account and what my latest smartphone is. Right? There's absolutely no way, by playing in to that agenda, to that framing, that we can change things. We have to say that's not the right way to look at the world. We have to, because otherwise, your life is just a series of consumables and how much profit I'm making, and it's beginning to be done. So in Germany, I'll just end on this. In Germany, there's a campaign for remunicipalization, could do with a better name, but remunicipalization of energy. I don't know what it is in German. Of energy services, and what they're saying, and we could say it here. What they're saying is, energy companies have run energy systems, energy resources, in a completely unhelpful way, socially and environmentally. And we want to take them over because we think we as people could run them better, not for profit, to help the environment and more equitably, so we don't have pensioners who have to have to decide between eating and warming their houses. And it's working. I mean, they're taking over energy resources. We could do that here too, but we can't do it by pretending that we all just have to worry about our investment and risks and other financial language.
But do you think there's
Okay, no, I'm going to bring the audience in now. So ask your questions, make your points. There's a hand up immediately here. So here comes the mic. If you can keep it to short and punchy, that'd be absolutely fantastic. 2 minutes, okay. I'm counting.
Very quickly, some people might have heard the concept of capitalist realism. It's summed up by the neat phrase that it's easier for us to foresee the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This event has been entirely ideologically framed. And I'll point out to the chair that he asked the nature capitalism question and then said false dichotomy, and everyone got to shout out about that. Those of us who feel not false dichotomy, those who feel it is a false dichotomy didn't get to say that, and I think that's very significant. Conversations like these, which Mr. Oppenheimer was saying, the poor people eventually, once they're rich enough, they can have about the world that's being destroyed for them. Sorry, I've only got 2 minutes, I'll be quick. The reality is that it's insane that we are saying, we all in this room, I imagine most of us, understand the risks that the OECD, that all these huge, the International Energy Agency, all of these august bodies are saying about the absolute catastrophic future that we are almost certainly committed to. And we are sitting in a room saying, how can we, supposedly we live in democracies, most of us in the world, and we are saying to ourselves, how can we persuade the tiny number of people that, as Nick Dearden points out, have taken over the vast majority of the world's resources and the vast majority of the world's political power, how can we try and persuade them to be part of not destroying the world for us? This is the point.
Okay.
And just very, very quickly, because this
This
is very important. Anyone who's read Naomi Klein's book will know this. There's a guy called Brad Werner. He delivered a hugely prestigious lecture to the American Geophysical Union saying, and it was called "Is Earth Fucked?"
Is Earth fucked? Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll take a vote on that later.
Unless there are disruptive social movements.
Thank you. Okay, good. Don't feel it's when you ask a question, don't feel it's necessary to attack me if you don't want to. But go ahead.
My question's a little bit shorter. To what extent do you think that the rise in support for the Green Party reflects the public desire for greener business over protest voting?
Very good, very good. The support for a party that wants to, as I understand it, legalise heroin and ban pate. I'm saying nothing. I'm fond of them both. Okay, there's a gentleman back there.
Thank you. Very briefly, there's a saying that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And I think we're getting values and prices confused here. Nature gives us value in so many different things, but to reduce it down to one price isn't even theoretically possible, let alone practically possible. You can't compare $1 from a rainforest to $1 from a fish to $1 of somebody's life. I don't think that's sort of really coming across in the debate.
Okay, panel, I'm going to ask you to come back to kind of one or two of these points. I was trying to get the microphone to a woman, but a man grabbed it. That's an unusual thing. But no, go ahead, sir.
I wouldn't want to take it from
I hope it's an important point.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure now. Is there a woman who wants to?
Yeah, it's fine. No, we'll come to the woman.
Okay. I'm so sorry for being a man.
It's fine.
Should be.
You're doing it very well.
Thank you. So my question, I work for a company called Wild Business, and we work with other big businesses. Some have been mentioned so far today. And we're based around this idea that what's good for nature is good for business. It's a nice tagline you have there. One of the problems we have is not working with people at the top of those businesses to convince them that that's the case. It's more working with people who, down at the level of, say, a factory or something like that, and convincing them of these arguments. It's easy to make at the level of a country or at the level of an ecosystem. Very, very hard to make at the level of a production site with 200 employees. So I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on how we can make those arguments. Interesting,
of course, that the issue of the environment and sustainability has gone down in terms of public awareness and salience over the last few years when people might have thought it would just go up and up and up. Yes, let's have the woman there. Oh, yes, at the top. Go on.
Kind of documentary series recently on Radio 4. I don't know if people have been hearing it about the Tata Group. and how, you know, historically and now it's a very charitable organisation and gives so much to social causes. And then there was a point raised that, look at the river there, the Jamshedpur River, it's completely polluted. And when that question was put to them, they said, well, we don't own it. And I just feel that that's a kind of symptomatic across the world. I completely agree with what Tony Juniper is saying, that when it comes to people or anything like that across the world, economic growth always trumps environmental values. And, you know, several years ago I heard a talk about TEEB, which sounds like it's like natural capital, and it totally lit up my, you know, inspiration. I thought that's amazing that now there are, you know, economic models being put to environmental values, because it's so true that water, soil, everything just has so much value attached to it that, you know, this makes such brilliant sense. That was years ago, and it just still seems to be a talking shop. I mean, my question is, you know, are there any milestones to actually, you know, implementing this within economic systems that you can see happening and envisaging?
Great, thank you. So, panel, just choose one of this very rich set of questions and points. Just choose one of them so that we can go back out to the audience, and I'm going to go up to the balcony when we do. Jeremy, it feels to me as though capitalism's kind of on the defensive slightly in the debate as we're going along. So do you want to pick up one of those particular points?
Well, I think I'll pick up on them all in one sense. It seems to me that if you want capitalism to do the right thing, then we need an environmental movement that actually can do its job properly. Right? And the reason that we haven't priced nature in its multiple forms or put the right regulations or policies in place is because the environmental movement has failed. Right? If the environmental movement had been successful, right, it would have influenced consumers. And I do want to take issue with Nick. I mean, the idea that poor people, right, aren't consumers and aren't investors demonstrates that you have very little understanding of the lives of poor people. Right? Because they do exactly both. They invest in their homes, they invest in their small holdings, they invest day in, day out, and they make small decisions that wouldn't feel like investment to you, but I guarantee you, as someone who spent many years in developing countries, that they feel like investments to the poorest people on the planet, but maybe not to you. So I think that the problem in all of this lies with the failure of the environmental movement to make its case effectively.
Okay. Glad to see we're moving towards consensus. Tony, that sounds like your failure.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Having spent so many years on this. However, I have to say, when history looks back on the fate of the world in 100 years' time and global capitalism has destroyed the planet it depends upon, I wonder who will have judged to have failed, whether it will be the environmentalists or the capitalists. That's one for the future. Hopefully it will be neither, because we will, in fact, have sorted out this question of value that was raised a moment ago and begun to understand the full contribution that is being made by natural systems to human well-being, including the process of economic development. And I think this is where environmentalists across the spectrum need to ask very carefully where they stand on this subject, because we are quite polarized at the moment. And I think the polarization is coming around a misunderstanding between these concepts of price and value. And I think the question a second ago touched on this very well. Price is about a transaction that occurs in a market. Value is about something's contribution. It's aesthetic, it's intrinsic, it's spiritual contribution, and indeed its practical and economic side. And the environmentalists have been very good so far and have succeeded in making the aesthetic, spiritual, and intrinsic case. What we've not done yet is make the economic case properly, and that's where I think we need to be focusing over the coming years. And if we do this successfully, that value isn't necessarily protected or maintained through markets. Very often it's regulation that's required to protect that value. And so, you know, last year we had a big debate about bumblebees in this country. Are neonicotinoid pesticides killing them? Yes, they are, very likely. Is that a problem? Well, bees are very beautiful, but also happen to be vital for food security. And once that practical point came across, we had a political reaction in the form of a European ban on those pesticides. We didn't need a bee market, but the fact that the bees were understood to be delivering value changed the politics, and I think that's what we need to do more of in the years ahead.
Peter?
So I want to take on the questions about reducing to one price and also working with the the manager, the people are actually in the factory. As I mentioned before in the introduction, I've been involved with over 24 projects in the field. In those projects, we've hired dozens of economists. We've never been asked, not once, been asked to reduce it to one price. Never. And this includes national governments, city governments, regional agencies, and corporations. We do put prices on the loss of water quality, on water treatment, on flood control, on risk mitigation, but we don't wrap it up in a $1 value. People are more sophisticated than that. But the fact that we put a price on it gets the Ministry of Finance at the table with us and not just the Minister of Environment, which is important. And the fact that we put a price on it it actually gives voice to different stakeholders. It actually gives voice to the farmers who lose the irrigation water, and we put a price on that loss to irrigation water as opposed to the city that might take the water. So it often gets talked about like there's just going to be $1 value at the bottom of this sheet, and it's going to do it all. In practice, that isn't it. The manager question, and what really happens in corporations, is very astute because we have a partnership with Dow. Liveris is one of these corporate leaders that pronounces very much about sustainability. But we work at the factory level. And at the factory level, the trick is to have easy tools. Nobody wants their job to be harder. And if we can make it scientifically credible and easy for them to look at their practices, their choices about whether they protect a marsh or build a levee, whether they protect a hardwood forest for water control or do water treatment. So those choices, if we can make it easy for them to think about those choices, they will pick it up. But it can't just, that's the whole point of hiring these software engineers and making it software that people can actually interact with and test, to really mainstreaming it to everyday business decisions and not just to the speeches of a CEO. So I think it can work, but it takes an extra step.
Lucy, can you see a way through what is emerging as a kind of fault line in the room? I mean, it feels to me as though the public, most of the public would like an excuse not to have to worry about this, and the fact that the people who say they care about the environment so fundamentally disagree about what needs to be done gives us all a way out, doesn't it?
Possibly. I think a huge amount of people would like a way forward that they believe is going to bring some substantive change. I think rather than trying to shirk the issue, I just wanted to talk about, this lady made a couple of points about outsourcing and sort of touched on philanthropy. So we see these big brands that have sort of made their money and then are doing good projects. And that makes me very uncomfortable, that I think this is a sort of slide towards this, make as much money, rape the resources as you will, and then you can put, some of your profits you can put into a nice little environmental project. I think that's an incredibly troubling way to go down. But I think that, I don't think we're short on corporate leadership and corporate speeches. And I'm always hearing, brilliant sustainability speeches from CEOs. I think we've got loads and loads of those. But I think that there's just a real essential problem that businesses are not in a position to do certain things, either at home or abroad. And as this lady again pointed out, so much is outsourced. So much of our environmental impact is outsourced, most of it actually. And we have these corporations who do not own the factories that stuff is built in, and therefore they don't have to take responsibility. So there's so many loopholes for them. Businesses are not good. It's not their place to talk about overpopulation or birth control in a country. It's not, and it would be completely unseemly for them to do so. So I have a real issue with businesses operating and speaking on certain issues. In Bangladesh, for example, which I've looked at a lot to do with fast fashion, there's a big wage debate, and we hear these fast fashion brands constantly say, well, we can't up our wages because then a garment worker would be getting more than a policeman. Who are they to be setting these kind of limits? and yet on other issues they stay silent. So I think that it comes back to trust, and I don't think that we can trust corporations to make these sort of decisions for us. And maybe the environmental movement has been weak, and I'd say where they have been weak is in appeasing business and not standing up for environmentalism for its own sake, in its own language, without reverting to the language of corporations.
Nick?
Oh yeah, well you don't even need me because that was brilliant. I
Okay,
totally agree. But on this issue of pricing nature, I would like to say something on this issue of pricing nature, because I think Tony's right. We've got to come down on one side or another, and I am firmly against this. And I think it's, first of all, I think it's theoretically just crazy. I mean, there are actually people working in the British government now who think it's possible to put prices on, like, you know, the amount of time that it would, the amount of time that we've got before such and such a thing degrades, on aesthetic values. How on earth can you put a price on aesthetic values? It's just, I think, completely ridiculous, apart from being very dangerous in terms of reinforcing the notion that we're all consumers and investors and so on. But I would go beyond that, because it's not just, I just think that's crazy and isn't going to work, so it doesn't really bother me. But the thing that I do think is dangerous is, Tony said, we never asked for a bee market. Well, I tell you, you're going to get markets in nature because they're already being set up. Biodiversity offset markets are already being set up. We already have carbon markets that, by the way, have been a complete disaster in terms of pouring funds into fossil fuel companies while we oversee a world that continues heating up. I mean, just an unbelievable disaster. There are biodiversity offset markets being set up now, which will allow companies to go on mining and go on doing all the damaging thing they're doing, and then give some money, and then somewhere else you can preserve some species that presumably, I don't know how you're going to create species, but you can preserve some species that are presumably of a similar value. I mean, I think Amnesty International should set up a human rights offset market so that a dictator in some country somewhere can torture somebody and then pay, and somewhere else we can run a nice human rights center. It really is at that level of ridiculousness, and I think we've really got to kill this idea that this is the way to save the environment.
Right. We have got very little time, but I want to take another round of questions. I'm going to give a free copy of Tony's book. Well, Tony's actually going to do it. He doesn't know this, but I'm telling him now. A free copy to the best very short question that we have in the next round. So I can't see you up there, but someone's got a microphone. Go for it.
Hi. I used to work at the World Bank, and I also worked with one of the world's leading asset managers in sustainability. So I find it very interesting that you separate or rather, that you seem to bundle the emotional desire to influence corporations, and yet there doesn't seem to be a specific goal towards a metric. I think it feels somewhat naive, the last gentleman who's writing down now, Nick, to separate the asset pricing. So what sort of metrics are you looking for? Because it seems to me that there are a number of sustainable investment firms that are working quite hard at assessing the impact of, say, water or CO2 emissions, or on building construction or retail or other industries. But specifically, how do you tend to get there? Because working with corporations, they will need to see some sort of bottom line.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll go to the lady right at the back there. And then we're going to go over there. Yep, okay, go on.
Thank you. At the moment, this is a bit of a UK parochial question, but there's a Wellbeing Act working its way through the Welsh Government, and quite a number of NGOs in England are pushing for a Nature and Wellbeing Act. If the panel members agree that's a good concept, what would they like to see in such an act?
Very good. And then over here.
Yeah, we are basically natural capitalists. And what we've been doing for the past 15 years is actually working with big and small business to see how what they can actually work with nature. In other words, having conversations with nature, using the premise of natural capital as a tool of getting big business to work with, or any business to work with nature. And one of the tools that are being used is ecological footprinting, which includes carbon footprinting, and the whole principles of biomimicry.
Okay, great, thank you. No one's got the book yet. Right, go.
With 100 days to go until the general election, and a distinct lack of talk of nature from any of our major policies, who are our stewards for nature? Is that the role of the civil service?
Oh. Very interesting question. Okay, this gentleman in a white shirt down here, please. Down, down, and across, down. Very good. Hooray.
Hi. My question is to Nick, really. I'm quite disappointed in terms of your stance or your view that as consumers, as Joe Blogs, we don't really have any power to change what is actually happening to our environment and our world. We don't want to be backseat participants to this stuff. So my question really is, what actually is your practical approach and what part can we actually take in making a change? If we can't trust the CEOs to make this change, we want to make this change. If you don't believe we have a place, what actually is our place?
So poor old panel, you're not going to have long. You have to choose one or two of these points. Back up here.
Hi, I think this is a respect and value issue. We don't have anyone really talking on behalf of Mother Earth here in Europe. We killed all our herbalists off as witches in the 16th, 17th century. We've killed all our indigenous people off, or we've certainly decimated them. We haven't given them a voice. All the stewards that have been there working for nature have been shut down, staked, burned, and drowned. I think that, and actually the role of women as Mother Earth has really no respect. I think that that's a big problem there. I also think it's very interesting that as we become richer and richer in the West and we have everything we need, we're becoming the most unhappy nations on the planet. We have the highest rate of mental illness that is increasing at a rate of knots, heart disease, cancer. I mean, the list goes on, and yet we're meant to be the most wealthiest, happy, and we have everything. So there's a serious disconnect between our relationship with nature and who we are. I'm a shaman. I work helping people reconnect to Mother Earth, and that's what we need. We are the stewards, each one of us. The corporation's not a CEO, it's not a corporation, it's people, and we make it up. We are the people. It's every one of us has to change our value systems. Every one of us has to realize that if we don't change, nothing's going to change, and that's where the power lies.
Great, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to take one from this side of the room. No, I'm not. There's nobody there who wants to speak. It's a very silent side of the room. Oh, no, there's somebody here who wants to speak. I'm sorry, but can you come over to this silent, thoughtful side of the room? Yeah. So where all the silent, thoughtful people are here.
Pressure's really on now. The real answer is that everyone on the panel is right, and all of those things have been happening for 30, 50, 100 years. And what is different now, and I think most discouraging, was just mentioned, the lobbyists, campaign finance, and the politicians. And that's what has radically changed, and what I think is threatening the success of all of the different approaches, which all need to be done and all lead to the successes that we've had over the last 30 years.
Very good, thank you. And then one from the middle and one from there, and then we're going to finish. Oh, yes, we'll have you because you're waving. Oh, and you've got the mic.
Yeah. Hi. Yes. I feel like we're focusing a lot on how we can change things, how we can change existing corporations. But I'm a believer that, if we can't change them, then, it's a lot of efforts. Why focus on them? Let's let them die and create the system you want to see, create from scratch and let that new system, those new businesses, overcome the existing thing that doesn't work. I'm thinking about companies like Patagonia, things like that. And so what I was expecting from here, or maybe hoping to hear, is what are maybe the principle or some rules to create businesses that work with nature? If I want to create a big business right now from scratch that doesn't exist, what are the rules to make it work with nature? That's what I would like to hear.
Okay, and then last but not least, I'm going to take the lady in the fur hat, although I'm sure it's not really fur, is it? Is it really fur? Okay.
When I look at the headline here, money can grow on trees, I think immediately of illegal logging, and that money does grow on trees for companies that are engaged in that trade. That's a very big subject, and which obviously it's a contradiction here, because it's not good for nature to cut down the trees, but it's good for some big business logging companies, furniture companies. But if you ask most people, maybe even in this room, when they go buy their furniture, do they go to IKEA because it's very cheap? Yes, they do. But the same people would sign a petition for the environment. But when it comes to their own pocket, They go to the cheap furniture store, which is engaged in illegal logging and unsustainable wood procurement.
Okay. Thank you for that, and good luck. Good luck with the libel action. Okay, so you're on your own. Okay, now panel, if you could, what I want you to do is I want you to pick a couple of points, and I want you to do one last thing, which is this, a call to action. So at the end of your, just 2 responses, people want to do, I mean, whatever, there's huge divisions in the room, but there's nobody in this room who doesn't care and doesn't care passionately. So I want the one thing that these people, as they walk out into the cold central London air, the one thing that they should do next. So we'll do it in reverse order from now. Nick, start with you.
So I'll pick up on the question that was directly asked to me about consumers. I mean, look, if you have a choice as a consumer and you can buy something really awful or something a bit better, buy something a bit better. Obviously, if I can buy a fair trade banana, I'll buy a fair trade banana. But I'm not under any illusion, and I wouldn't think anybody is, that that's going to radically change the world. What we have to do is stop thinking about ourselves as consumers and start thinking about ourselves as citizens. We don't have to just live in this world in the way that it is presented to us at this point in time. And indeed, we haven't done. After the Second World War, we decided many, many things should not be controlled by the market. And that happened through people power. It's happened in Latin America over the last 15 years. A woman up there talked about Mother Earth. That's now enshrined in constitutions in Latin American countries, where, by the way, ownership has moved from big business to cooperatives, to the social sector, where people are re-engaging in democracy. It's sad to me that people think the first thing we think about is what we can do as a consumer. Why should big business be accountable to anybody in this room? And let me tell you, it isn't. It's not accountable to you at all. It's about making money. That's what it has to do in law. So that's what it's going to do. We need to take power back from big business. And we can do it. And it's happening in Germany. It's happening in Latin America. It happened in Greece last weekend. And we have to give solidarity to those movements that are reclaiming it and start reclaiming it here. 68% of people in a recent opinion poll thought energy companies should be renationalized, yet no political party has it on the agenda. We have to force it onto the agenda in the way that they're doing in Germany, because they don't represent us, so we have to represent ourselves.
One thing you want people... one concrete thing you want people to do?
There's no one thing. You have to change. You have to... Okay, taking power can't be done by
change
one,
itself.
one thing.
Yeah, okay, got it, absolutely. Lucy.
I'd like to respond to your question about if you were going to reinvent or start a business, or you're an entrepreneur, what are the core things that you should do? And I think the first thing that you do is make a commitment from the start not to grow too big, because I don't believe that constant expansion, sorry to keep going back to fashion, fast fashion brand last week revealed it had opened 400 new stores in the first quarter of the year. You know, and it's this constant expansion, which means it then has to go into other territories to source cotton, for example, moving into Ethiopia, moving into Myanmar. And actually, what's happening is we're not seeing a new strategy, a new business strategy. It's all predicated on growth, opening more, producing more inventory, and that is completely incompatible with being an environmental, socially just, ecological, sustainable business. So the first thing that you have to commit to is that you're going to have a certain cap, that you're not going to grow, and you have to understand where your cap would be. So I think that's the first thing. I think in terms of one thing, I agree with Nick, it's really hard to give one specific point. I would say do something just to disconnect from the cheap food, the cheap tech, what was the other thing that I said before? I can't remember, no one's listening. Cheap fashion, oh my God, I forgot fashion. Weird. My brain's short-circuiting. Is to disconnect from that. Do something for yourself. Make something, knit something, do your compost, do something just to disconnect from these global corporations, even if it's just one thing, and just examine what you can do for yourself.
Great, thank you very much. Jeremy, perhaps McKinsey ought to hire a shaman. That occurs to me as a radical step that you might want to take. Jeremy, over to you.
I thought we've been called the witch doctors in
been
various books, so it would be not entirely inappropriate. I'm not sure how to answer the questions or any of them, other than to agree with the observation that it's not that we can delegate being stewards for nature to the civil service or to corporations or to the NGOs. I think we all have to play our role within that. And that's at the heart of the change that we need to see. If we don't step up to do that, if we aren't able to somehow deal with the contradictions in our own behavior. I mean, every single person in this room lives an internally inconsistent life in terms of environment and what we consume and what we don't. And maybe there's some, saint out there in the room that doesn't live it inconsistently, but I certainly do. And I suspect most people, if they examine their lives, would acknowledge that. And it's hard, right? It's very hard to confront it and to think through what to do.
But hypocrisy is underrated anyway.
It may well be, right? So I start with, I'm going to end with kind of just a couple of observations. One is, I am a bit more optimistic than others on the panel. It's not because I think we've cracked it, but I don't give up on young people. I don't think that they are hopeless, irresponsible, disconnected, and unthinking. I think young people will be the generation who will take much of this on, and we have to help them. Those of us that do have positions of power, and everybody on this panel in one way or another has those positions, so it's our job to get on and support the young people that want to come through and build the new businesses on different principles. I'm also a bit more optimistic about poor people. Right? I don't think of them as helpless victims, and I don't think any of us should do, but I think we should have this conversation with a Rawlsian point of view about kind of, where we stand in the world, right? We have no clue on the whole what it means to be truly poor and the choices, both consumer and investor, that those poor people make and how they incorporate environment into their lives. And that will decide and determine to a very large extent how the story really plays out, because it will be in the developing world where nature is both most at risk, most work needs to be done and most support needs to be provided, that this debate will either land in a good way or not. So that's where, for me, this whole agenda ends up. And if I had one thing to do, and I'm sorry if it sounds like being kind of beating a drum, it is that I don't think the environmental movement is doing its job properly. I think there are exceptions, and I'm delighted to be next to Peter, actually, because I think what TNC is trying to do is exactly right. It's trying to combine an approach to environmental conservation with an understanding of development. How do poor people live and how will they develop? And how do we use different mechanisms, different forms of innovation, including pricing, which is very sophisticated. Anyone who thinks it's one price has no clue about how markets work, not a single clue. So let's embrace the sophistication of the very complex institutions that we have that are called markets and bring them to bear in a thoughtful, intelligent, wise, humane way that also recognizes that we can't price everything and get these things to work. Right? So that's our job, to get the environmental movement to step up, to do its job much better, right, if we want to have a hope of bringing nature and capitalism together.
Okay, so these are radical... So far we have smash the system, take up knitting, leave Greenpeace. 2 more bids for what you need to do as you leave the room. Tony.
We were reminded a moment ago that there is a general election coming very soon, and there was a point raised up here about proposals for a Nature and Wellbeing Act. I would say that this is a huge opportunity that we have in the months ahead and indeed the years after the election to have game-changing legislation and policy in this country. The Nature and Wellbeing Act is presently not supported by the main parties. The Green Party have adopted it as their policy. That's very good. But we need to get this higher on the agenda in the run-up to the general election. What would be in a Nature and Wellbeing Act? The headline is the restoration of nature in a generation. So in 25 years, to restore nature in this country. Bear in mind that this was the first place to properly industrialize. We began deforesting and destroying natural systems in this country literally thousands of years ago. We really got going a couple of hundred years ago, and we showed the world how to destroy nature for the name of economic growth. I think it would be very inspiring for the entire world, for the home of industrialization to be the place where we say, actually, we can do things differently. we can restore nature at the same time as looking after people, rebuilding our economy, and delivering lots of very, very good things for people. Clean, secure water, food security, better health, carbon capture, fecund seas, a better tourism industry. All these things would come on the back of doing that job properly. That's the headline. Beneath the headline is the idea of rebuilding green infrastructure. So all those things that nature provides for us, let's explicitly put them back into good shape. In the process, for example, saving our National Health Service billions of pounds per year. Let's change the education system. The point about reconnection from the lady up here. We have lost touch with nature. This is why this discussion is so abstract for so many people. We are embedded in nature. Without nature, there is nothing else for humankind. We need to rebuild that connection, and we can do it through the education system. And then I would also say in that Nature and Wellbeing Act, we need a fuller understanding of the economic contribution coming from nature, and we need something like the Climate Change Committee, which we have in this country, which monitors policy. It looks at the state of our emissions. It advises government. We need that on nature too. And as somebody who played a role at Friends of the Earth in making the case for the Climate Change Act back in 2008, which led the world, it was the first national framework to set a scientific long-term target to reduce CO2 emissions, I would tell you that it can happen, even if it's not on the agenda yet. And that brings me back to Nick's point about being citizens, because we all get to vote, those of us who are British in this room, in the next couple of months. The action to take out of here is to demand that all the parties who are candidates where you will vote, that they adopt a Nature and Wellbeing Act as part of their manifestos. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the main point in here as well.
Peter, you have the unenviable task of following that.
I'll be mild. At first, the remark that we're all right is certainly true. I mean, the environment movement's only going to succeed if it has government regulation, if it has corporations, and if it has people as individuals in public and social. It's sort of the three pillars. And different groups emphasize different things, so we're all right. I am much more optimistic by direct personal experience. First of all consumer movements haven't failed. 30 years ago, we killed 7 million dolphins every year to get tuna. Now we kill less than 6,000 dolphins every year to get tuna. That was a consumer movement. Dolphin save tuna. And I teach every year. I'm not supposed to, but I teach a class every year. My boss sort of knows. But consistently, kids come up to me after they're graduating seniors, and they come up and they ask permission to work for companies, the best and the brightest, on the basis of, is the company doing environmental good? There really is a value among some of the most talented young people that they actually look where they're working. They look to where they're working, and they want to work for someplace. The smartest programmer I ever saw, the most brilliant kid I ever saw, had worked as an academic, and he came up to me 2 years ago and wanted to work for a company, and asked permission, like I had to give it to him. And so if I was to say one thing you would do, this is going to sound wacko, but it's my personal thing. So this connection is all this is so intellectual and abstract, but I'm trained as an evolutionary biologist. All of you have been walked down a street in a dark night and felt something on the back of your neck. Your hair stand up? That's you as prey. It is. That's you as prey. You are a part of nature. And I think you would all do much more about it and be much more committed if you went out and just noticed how you felt differently by going out and experiencing nature. I know that sounds corny, but go out and experience nature. Take your kids out, take your friends out. You will physically feel different. And there's more and more science data to show that. And that feeling, I think, can give you the energy to do something about it. Because, I love this geeky and this analytical talk and these numbers, but it really takes energy to do anything with government or with corporations or with social movements, and that will give you the energy. That's my one thing.
Thank you. Peter, thank you for that. And I think the one fact people will take back is that tuna fact. So you've left us all with a positive fact. People say, how was it? Well, it was a bit gloomy, but do you know this thing about the tuna is great? Anyway, so I want to say thank you to Nature Conservancy for making this possible. I want to say thank you to Intelligence Squared for making this possible. I want to thank you, because none of you won the book, because the questions were never that short, but they were really fascinating, even those of you who abused me. You made for a really brilliant debate. But most of all, I have got to, because they didn't shirk. You know, you criticised them, you attacked them, they sat there, they took it, they fought back, and they were brilliant. Please thank our wonderful panel.